Rachel Porter had never believed in bad omens until that foggy night in Ashford. Walking her dog Rex along the forest road, she heard footsteps crunching behind her, but when she turned, there was nothing. Rex barked furiously, yanking toward an abandoned firehouse. Wind hissed through the cracked boards, carrying the faint smell of old smoke. Inside, a rusted fire truck sat like a tomb. On the driver's seat lay a bloodstained notebook, with chilling words scrawled across the page. "They will burn to cover it up." From that moment on, Rachel's life would never be peaceful again. Rachel Porter lived on the edge of Ashford, where the Pacific Northwest pines covered the slopes and the fog never seemed to lift. The town had once thrived on coal mining, but now it was little more than peeling houses, a rundown bar, and people who had learned to survive by staying silent. At 34, Rachel was a tough mechanic. Her small repair shop sat on the main road, the rusty sign out front barely holding on, but inside there were always customers, mostly working folks who couldn't afford full payment yet still left with their cars fixed. Rachel's hands were calloused, smeared with grease, but the scars on her heart were deeper. Her husband Ethan, a volunteer firefighter, had died in a forest fire 10 years earlier. The memory of that night still haunted her. Rachel rushed to the scene when the fire radio crackled in the dark. Sirens wailing, the stench of smoke. The sky painted red with flames, but all she found was his charred helmet. The report called it an accident. Rachel never believed it. Ethan had once warned her. "Some fires don't come from nature, Rachel, they're made." As Rex pulled hard toward the abandoned firehouse tonight, that old feeling returned. The place was rotting. Once it belonged to the volunteer crew, it is now left to decay. Wind whistled through the cracks, moaning like the building was in pain. Rachel shoved the rusted door open and stepped inside. Rex barked sharply, claws scraping at the thick dust. A fire truck emerged in the gloom, its frame eaten with rust, its lights shattered. But what froze Rachel's breath was on the driver's seat. An old leather notebook, its cover stained dark brown like dried blood. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and flipped through the pages. Inside were maps of public lands around Ashford Lake, lines erased and redrawn in pencil, as if someone had altered the boundaries. The last page stopped her cold. Shaky handwriting scrawled in blotchy red ink read, "They will burn to cover it up." Rachel dropped into the seat, clutching the book. Her heartbeat thundered, echoing the fire sirens from the night Ethan died. Her body went numb, but one thought burned through. This was no coincidence. Rex growled again, eyes fixed on the doorway. Rachel looked up. Through the swirling fog, she saw a dark figure slip past. Heavy footsteps crunched the leaves, then faded into silence. Ashford had long lived with buried secrets, but at that moment, Rachel knew she had stumbled upon one of the town's secrets that it had tried to keep hidden for 30 years. Rachel left the firehouse with the notebook stuffed tightly in her backpack. The night fog thickened, swallowing the road whole. Rex kept glancing back, growling low, his hackles bristling. Rachel quickened her pace, her pulse pounding. Behind her, faint headlights cut through the mist. A pickup crawled slowly, holding its distance. She darted onto a shortcut back to the shop. At the fork, the truck idled, engine rumbling, then turned away. Rachel stood frozen, sweat cold on her back. In a town as small as Ashford, everyone knew everyone, but that truck with its mud-smeared plates she'd never seen before. Back at the shop, Rachel flipped on every light. Rex still barked at the door. She dropped the backpack onto the workbench, then froze. On the front door, someone had spray painted a single word in dripping red, bold and vicious. "Quiet." Rachel clenched her fists. Fear swelled, but anger burned hotter. They knew she had seen, and they wanted her silent. She pulled the notebook back out, flipping carefully through the penciled maps. She spotted a note in block letters among the scribbles, accelerant same as 88. Rachel collapsed into her chair, chest tightening. Ethan once spoke of an accelerant, a chemical that made fires explode faster. The 1988 blaze, the same fire that killed him, maybe it hadn't been an accident at all. Rachel knew she couldn't keep this secret to herself. One name came to mind, Lena Brooks. A young reporter broke down outside the shop 3 years earlier during a storm. Rachel had fixed her flat for free. They'd talked only briefly, but Rachel remembered Lena's eyes sharp, unafraid to dig deep. Later, Rachel found Lena's blog, Ashford Undercurrent, which exposed corruption and shady deals that the local paper wouldn't touch. Lena had once worked for a regional paper but was fired for being too loud. Rachel opened her old laptop, hands shaking. She scanned every notebook page and snapped photos of the rusted truck. Before sending them, she zipped the file and set a simple password. Ethan. Childish maybe, but at least it was something. Her email was short, just one line. Henry Clark, 1988. "I don't think he died naturally. I have proof. Do you want to see it?" She hit send, then leaned back in her chair. The wall clock ticked, the yellow shop light flickered. Rex refused to lie down, circling the door, ears pinned forward. Outside, the faint hum of an engine drifted, then cut off. Rachel knew Ashford was no longer safe. She stared at the notebook, thought of Ethan, and whispered, "If you were right, this is only the beginning." The next morning, Rachel had barely slept. She sat in her chair, eyes glued to her inbox, waiting for a reply. Rex lay at her feet but never relaxed, ears pricked. growling now and then at nothing. Around 9 a.m., the email came, just one line, "Meet me, old doc, noon, bring the notebook." Rachel drew a deep breath, a mix of relief and dread flooding her chest. She packed the notebook into her backpack and headed toward the lake with Rex. Ashford's dock had once been lively every summer. Families fished, kids leapt into the water, and there were small festivals with food stalls and live music. But after the land around the lake was sold for a real estate project that collapsed, the shoreline turned foul, fish floated belly up, and the dock was left to rot. The wood sagged, ropes snapped, weeds swallowed everything. Lena Brooks was waiting, bundled in a heavy coat, camera in hand. As Rachel approached, she only nodded, no greeting. "Show me." Rachel handed over the notebook. Lena flipped through quickly, her eyes catching the red scrawl. "They will burn to cover it up." Her face darkened. "I wrote about Henry Clark once. He disappeared in 1988. Everyone said he ran off. I always suspected he was silenced, but I never had proof until now." Rachel swallowed hard. "Ethan, my husband, died in a fire they also called an accident. I think it's connected." Lena snapped the notebook shut, her voice firm. "Then they burned the forest to erase the land deal. Henry knew, and he paid the price." Before Rachel could respond, Rex erupted in furious barking, lunging toward the old boathouse nearby. Rachel yanked the leash and ran after him. Inside the dim shed, Rex clawed at the floorboards, nails scraping. Rachel crouched and dragged out a metal object. It was an old firefighter's radio, charred and with severed wires dangling. She wiped it clean, then flicked it on. Static crackled, then a shaky male voice spilt out. "This fire isn't natural. They lit it to wipe the land clean. If I don't make it, remember, this is no accident." A burst of static, then a deafening pop. The radio went dead. Rachel froze, tears stinging her eyes. Lena whispered, "That was Henry. He tried to leave his last words." Just then Rex snarled, straining at the leash. Rachel spun around outside. Through the fog, a black pickup had stopped. Its headlights flared, aimed straight at the boathouse. The engine roared, but no one stepped out. Lena held her breath. "They know we're here." Rachel clutched the radio to her chest, heart pounding. The darkness outside wasn't just watching. It was waiting for them to make the wrong move. Rachel and Lena left the dock as dusk fell. The black pickup still sat there, headlights blazing, but no one emerged. They cut through the forest trail, hearts pounding. Rex led the way, growling now and then as if to remind them not to stop. Back at the shop, Rachel froze. On the front door, a rusted wrench was jammed deep into the wood, its handle still quivering as if freshly struck. A tool tied to her trade had been twisted into a threat. Lena snapped a quick Rachel clenched her fists. "They want me to know I'm not safe even in my own house." That night, Rachel tried sleeping in the living room, Ethan's revolver at her side. Rex curled tight against the bed, ears sharp. Around midnight, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, "Stay quiet or burn again." Rachel dropped the phone onto the table, her hand shaking. Another message arrived, this time a photo. Rex curled asleep beneath the shop window. Rachel's stomach lurched. Someone had been close enough to take the shot. She yanked the curtains open, gun raised into the dark. Nothing, just wind and shifting branches, but she knew now, whoever was watching wanted her to understand they were always near. The next morning, Lena returned with an older man at her side. He was gaunt, gray-haired, eyes hollowed yet burning as they fell on the notebook. Lena introduced him. "This is Samuel Clark, Henry's brother." Rachel stiffened. Samuel nodded, voice raspy. "I've kept quiet 35 years. The day my brother vanished, I asked everywhere. The sheriff told me Henry ran off. Stop asking. I knew they lied. But all I had was a copy of the report Henry once gave me." From his coat pocket, he pulled a yellowed sheet. Rachel spread it on the table. It was a technical report on Ashford Lake. Details of improper water releases that dried the land, making it ignite easily. At the bottom, Henry's note read, "Violation of federal NEPA law, government hands all over this." Rachel shivered. Everything matched. The maps in the notebook, the words on the radio. Henry had uncovered a scheme to burn the forest and erase the illegal sale of public land. Ethan had died 10 years later in a fire, which the authorities also called an accident. Rachel looked from Samuel to Lena. "If we don't act, they'll keep burying the truth, and more people will die." Outside, an engine growled faintly, echoing through the hills. Rex growled back, eyes locked on the door. Rachel drew a deep breath. This time, she no longer felt alone. She had allies, and the real fight was only just beginning. That afternoon, Samuel sat at the workbench, his trembling hands clutching the old sheet of paper. He whispered before he died, "Henry told me if anything happens, look under the water tower north of the lake. I went once, but I didn't have the courage to dig. Now it's time." Rachel packed the notebook and the charred radio into her backpack, slipping in Ethan's revolver. Lena slung her camera over her shoulder, while Samuel gripped an old flashlight. Rex trotted ahead, leading the way. The water tower stood in the middle of the forest, a relic built during the New Deal era, now just a skeleton of rusted steel. Moss carpeted the cracked concrete walls, and weeds overran the place. The silence was unnerving, as though the tower was guarding a secret it didn't want disturbed. Samuel led them to a massive oak and pointed at the ground. "My brother used to say the earth never lies. If anything's here, it'll be right here." Rachel and Lena dug with shovels. The soil was damp and the stench of rot was heavy in the air. Rex stood watch, ears pricked. After more than half an hour, metal clanged against steel. Rachel clawed away the dirt until a small safe emerged, rusted but intact. The lock was corroded, Samuel muttered. Henry always used his daughter's birthday for the code. Rachel spun the dial, 0719, a sharp click, the safe opened. Inside, bundles of papers bound with rubber bands, public land records detailing the sale of Ashford's forest to a real estate developer, signed by the mayor and sheriff in 1988. Beside them lay a reel-to-reel tape marked, Meeting 3-5-1988. Samuel's voice broke. Henry knew everything, and they killed him to keep him silent. Rachel shoved the files and tape into her pack. Just then Rex barked, fur bristling. From a distance, the rumble of an engine rolled closer. A black SUV crept near, headlights sweeping the trees. They followed us, Lena gasped. Rachel yanked Samuel up. Run, they bolted into the woods. Rex led the way. Gunfire cracked behind them, one bullet grazing Lena's shoulder, leaving a streak of blood. Rachel grabbed her, heart hammering. The SUV roared, headlights slicing along the tree line. Another shot rang out, splintering wood in front of them. Rachel clutched the backpack tight, her breath ragged. There was no doubt now, they carried evidence the town had been forced to bury for over 30 years, and whoever was behind it would stop at nothing to take it back. They scrambled down a slope, wet leaves slipping underfoot. Rex charged ahead, barking, leading them on. Rachel clutched the backpack, the weight of the files inside like stone. Behind them, the SUV's lights flashed, gunfire cracking through the night. A bullet slammed into a tree, wood shards exploding. There. Samuel pointed to a crumbling concrete structure. A derelict water reservoir, its iron door warped and rusted. Rachel shoved hard, the hinges gave way, and the group slipped inside. Darkness swallowed them, damp and suffocating. They pressed against the wall, panting. Rex growled, eyes fixed on the crack of light under the door. Rachel clicked on her small flashlight, sweeping the beam. In the corner sat a dust-covered wooden table. On it was a large reel-to-reel recorder. The label was scrawled in messy handwriting. Private meeting, May 1988. Their hearts froze. Rachel's hands shook as she pressed play. Static hissed, then a cold male voice. The deal is done, land signed. Erase the evidence. The fire will cover everything. Another voice trembling. What about Henry Clark? He has copies of the files. A fist slammed on the table. Then deal with him tonight. Samuel staggered, tears spilling down his cheeks. That's Mayor Mason and Sheriff Hale. Before Rachel could stop the recorder, footsteps thundered outside. The iron door rattled violently, then a rough voice barked. Hand it over or you all die here, Rex growled fiercely. Rachel drew Ethan's revolver, her hands shaking but her eyes steady. The door burst open. A tall man stormed in, gun raised. Rachel leveled her weapon, heart in her throat, but before she could fire, a second light cut through the dark. A commanding voice rang out. FBI, drop your weapon now. Two agents surged in, guns drawn. Intruder cursed, throwing his weapon to the floor. Rachel staggered back, lowering her own. Lena whispered, I called them, sent the file copies last night. Rachel stood frozen, her whole body trembling, not just from the narrow escape but also from the realization that Ashford's secret was no longer buried. Samuel collapsed to his knees, covering his face. Henry, finally you're heard. Rachel clutched the backpack, watching as the agents cuffed the man. For the first time, a spark of hope pierced the thick fog smothered Ashford for decades. The news exploded overnight. Regional TV crews swarmed into Ashford, crowding outside Rachel's shop. The leaked FBI tape spread across the internet. The voices of Mayor Mason and Sheriff Hale plotting to burn to cover it up. In a town accustomed to silence, whispers turned to chatter and open outrage. Rachel sat inside her shop, staring out the window. On the wooden bench lay the bloodstained notebook, the charred radio and the land records, now sealed away in FBI evidence bags, but to her they were no longer objects. They were the voices of Henry, Ethan, and everyone buried. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Samuel sat in the front row, his hands gripping his cane, as the judge read the names of the accused. Mayor Mason and former Sheriff Hale. The room held its breath. The prosecutor opened the files, then played the recording. Mason's cold voice rang from the speakers. The fire will cover everything. Several people broke down in tears. An elderly woman stood and shouted, you stole my brother from me. But the climax came when an unexpected witness stepped forward. A retired firefighter, hair white, hands trembling, he said, I was there that night. I heard Mason give the order. I've stayed silent 35 years, but no more. The courtroom fell silent, then erupted. Rachel sat in the back, her heart pounding. When Hale's eyes swept over her, cold and hateful, she didn't look away. She stared back, and every ounce of fear left her at that moment. The judge's gavel cracked. Under the Constitution of the United States, and with irrefutable evidence, the defendants are sentenced to life imprisonment. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of Ashford residents gathered. The crowd roared when the verdict was announced, justice for Henry. The chant echoed into the gray sky, rolling across the square. Samuel wept, clutching Rachel. My brother is finally vindicated. Rachel looked around. The same faces that once hung low in fear now lifted high, eyes blazing. Ashford was no longer a town of silence for the first time in years. She whispered, as if to Ethan, we did it, justice lives again. The following spring, Ashford had changed. The once rotting dock was rebuilt into a community park. At its center stood a granite monument carved with Henry Clark's name and the words, "A man who gave his life for the truth." On the day of its unveiling, the townspeople gathered in full. Bright sunflowers surrounded the stone, swaying in the breeze like thousands of tiny flames. Samuel stood quietly, his hand trembling as he touched the engraving. Tears streamed down his face. But they were tears of peace. He whispered, "My brother, at last you're no longer forgotten." Rachel stayed back, never seeking the spotlight, but many approached to thank her. A grieving mother placed a hand on her shoulder and murmured, "My son died in that fire, thank you for not giving up." A young boy set down a toy fire truck at the monument's base and said, "I want to be a firefighter like Henry." Rachel's throat tightened, her eyes stinging. The change wasn't only in memory. After the trial, the public land around Ashford Lake was returned to the town. The state approved an ecotourism project, turning the lake and regrown forest into a destination for nature lovers. Tourists began to return, cafes and small shops opened, and dozens of families found work. Once a place of silence, Ashford found new breath in the very land that had nearly been stolen. Rachel's repair shop also changed. A new sign hung above the door, "Porter and Clark, Repairs and Restorations." She told Samuel, "Your brother's name belongs here." He nodded, smiling faintly. Lena kept writing, her Ashford Rising series spreading far and wide, turning the once quiet town into a symbol of those who dared to speak truth. Rachel began hosting weekend classes at the shop. A handful of teenage girls came to learn how to change oil, patch tires, and listen to the rhythm of an engine. She said, "When you know how to fix things, you're not afraid when they break. Not just cars, life too. If you see something wrong, have the courage to speak up." The girls' eyes shone, as if glimpsing a future they hadn't known was possible. Rex, older now, still lay faithfully at the doorway, eyes sharp. People called him the guardian of Ashford. To Rachel, he was the silent witness of it all. One evening, Rachel sat on the porch, watching the moonlight shimmer on Ashford Lake. Samuel sat beside her, Lena too. The three of them were quiet, coffee steaming in their cups. But this silence no longer threatened. It was the silence of peace. Rachel whispered, "Ethan once told me justice doesn't live in big buildings. It lives in small people who stand up." He was right. Samuel nodded. Lena added, "And there are lights that, once kept alive, never go out." Rachel smiled, feeling her heart lighter than it had in years. Ashford was no longer a town that bowed its head. It had learned to stand tall, thanks to a grease-stained mechanic, a loyal dog, and a blood-stained notebook. The fire of justice once lit would never die.